I'm muting you, kid.
Okay, and I'm going live right now.
Good luck.
Good luck. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Johannes Vloothuis, and it's nice to see you all. And we're going to spend a nice afternoon together. I got some secret weapons for you watercolor artists, things that you've never seen before that you're really going to appreciate it. And
I'm muting you, kid.
yeah.
Okay, and I'm going live
Hold
right
on.
now.
Hold on. Let me just.
Good luck.
I have to mute this.
Hello, everybody. My name is Johannes.
Okay, let's do this. Okay. Hi. Sorry, we have to coordinate a 20-second live feed. My name is Johannes Vloothuis, and I'm a professional artist, and I work with watercolor, oils, and pastels. I've been an instructor for Artist Network for now 10 years exactly. So I have some secret weapons for you guys today, you watercolorists, things that I'm sure you've never seen before. Your jaw is going to drop when you see how you can fix watercolors with simple machines that you can have at home, like a water pick. Yeah, like for your teeth, a water pick. So let's get started, and I'll talk a little bit more about me as we go ahead. We, want to keep this to about 2 hours. Anyway, we also, I just want to introduce Jude. She will be narrating the demo here. She'll be reading your questions. So if anything is addressed to me, whether it's a comment or question, just please write in capital letters, and she will read it out loud, and that way it gets recorded. Okay, so watercolor. Why is watercolor such a popular medium, but yet such a difficult medium to work with? And the reason is that it's very brilliant in the sense, well, you have to be brilliant to do a brilliant watercolor. In other words, reduce your mistakes. And if not, you'll learn how to fix them today. I just thought I wanted to put that in there. But what happens is that if you look at this range of pigments here, they're very brilliant, they're very bright. That's because you're not mixing white. And the reason of that is the light goes through the pigment like when you're wearing sunglasses, bounces off the white paper and comes back to your eyes. And so it carries that extra light with it. So you can put a watercolor in some dark corner in your house, and it doesn't need an halogen light, whereas oils really do need, if you really want it to shine as much as a watercolor, you have to add a halogen light on top of it, like a gallery light. Anyway, so what makes it difficult to correct or to lift off paint? If you look at the paper microscopically, you'll see little ridges like this. So it's pressed cotton. And if you look at it with in a microscope, you'll see like little fibers are intertwined like a basket. And so the water sort of like seeps its way in, finds its way through the paper, and then it sits inside. And the problem is how do you get paint out that's already deeper in the fibers? So it would look somewhat like this. I can show you the texture. There you go, right there. You see the little grooves there, the little valleys? That's where the pigment settles. And so the normal way that most people correct a watercolor is they wet it and they use like a paper towel or something to scrub it. But that doesn't work entirely because you still don't get the pigment that settles inside these little grooves here. So I came up with this little contraption. So I did this little demo here, and let's say that this red bush is a little bit too loud in the painting. So what I'm going to use here is a water pick. Can you imagine that? A water pick. First, got to get my towel there. So we'll start right off the bat with one of my best tools anyway. So here we go. I put a towel here so that it protects the water from running down. Isn't that so cool? You can also lift highlights out on your bushes too. Now that's a very...
Is there an advantage to using the water pick, Joe?
Yes, because the water is going to penetrate inside those fibers. Now I used what is called Graham paint here, which is more stubborn than Arches, what do you call it? Winsor & Newton, sorry. So I just wanted to show you the stubborn one. It's also important to know the classification.
And we're going to spend a nice afternoon together.
Oh, there's something coming back here.
Watercolor artists, things that you've never seen before that you're really.
Oh, okay. I just hit my keyboard. Okay, just playing the recording. Okay, so I'm gonna use Winsor Newton paints. You're gonna see it's much more successful. So it's also important to know the quality of your paints. Winsor Newton is a different body that the other one was Graham. Graham uses honey, so it really sticks to the paper. So you don't want that on your watercolor paper if you think that you're gonna have a lot of corrections. So let me just dry this for a second. Okay, sorry. I turned it off because of the heater. I mean the hair dryer. Okay, anyway, I put burnt sienna here. And sorry about that, guys. It's a live session. These things happen. I put some burnt sienna there, and so I sprayed it out. This is Winsor Newton paints, and as you can see, it comes out almost completely satisfactory enough to go back on top of that. You all hear me now, right?
I hear you now.
Yeah. Sorry. I just didn't want that sound of the hair dryer. Was very, very hard on your ears.
We're used to it, Joe. It's okay.
All right. Okay. So anyway, that's my secret weapon number one, a water pick. So you can experiment with that. Also, I've been able to lift out some very nice waterfalls with that. So you paint the water in, and then you start using the tip, and you can paint the waterfall. Very cool. Okay. Next secret weapon. So you're just going to dry this off with the towel. Do you see anything weird in this little spot there? Anything that's different to you? Or does it just look like an average watercolor block-in? Well, there's a product that's called Daniel Smith Watercolor Ground. And the cool thing about this is I added that to the paper first. You can see the texture. You can get oil-like texture. And I painted around that. Some of the pigment hit the paper directly. Other areas hit the watercolor ground. The areas that hit the watercolor ground are giving you automatic highlights. Here, I'm going to demonstrate that. So who says you can't get texture in watercolor? Now, besides texture, obviously this is a correction tool, right? Because if there's an area that I don't like, I can go over it, I can paint over it and correct it. So I'll demonstrate that as well. So I can just block out the area. Let's say over in here, just for the sake of it, let's pretend that I don't like that area. Of course, the best thing would be to wash that off. But let's say, oh, you know what? I have a better idea. I'm going to do a little tree demo, and then we negative paint and then correct it. Here. Okay, let's do this.
Would you call this the watercolor gesso product?
It's called Watercolor Ground. Okay, so
So my artsy tribe wants to know, is this like gesso?
no, it's I would say it's more like watercolor ground, pastel ground, more than watercolor. I mean, more than gesso.
Oh, so it has like a pumice type thing in it?
No, it looks like that. Okay, so I'm just gonna do a quick demo. Now, when you're painting something and you have to decide on the watercolor paper, take into account that rough paper is going to absorb the pigment more than cold pressed. Therefore, it's going to be more difficult for you to remove unwanted paint. Cold press, it tends to sit on top, which makes it more cooperative to remove the paint. So you got to consider that.
Is the ground hard on brushes?
No, you just wash it with soap and water at the end. It's like,
Can you use it with acrylics?
I haven't tried it with it. It's not designed for acrylics. Okay, I'm going to purposely make this tree monochromatic because I'm going to show you. Oh, I got another secret weapon. I was wrong to say that there's only 3.
Can you use this with pastels?
I haven't tried it. Pastel has its own ground. Okay, so let's just let that figure. It's all monochromatic. That's not the way I usually paint. I'm gonna hit that with the hair dryer, but this time I won't turn off the sound. I'm glad I have you there, Jude, warning me. Wait, I wanted to purposely make this too symmetrical. Yeah, let's make a mistake here. So we got a round tree. There. We don't like the round trees like that. Okay, so
Excuse me, Joe. Does the ground come in different colors?
I think there's I think it's white. There's a white one and a transparent. I'm not sure on the transparent. For sure there's a white. The thing is, this ground is designed to do a watercolor, let's say on a board or on something crafty like a saw or one of those like an old, let's say, pancake pan or something. But anyway, so I'm going to do this, and I'm going to negative paint in there. Now that should be able to take the sky, like the blue sky. So let's suppose I made a mistake, right? And I say, okay, this is too round. I'm going to negative paint that in there, spread it out, unless I want texture, but you don't want texture in the sky. Spread it out. That becomes absorbent for watercolor. Let's say keep negative painting here, spread it out. Nice and thin, so when you put the watercolor wash on there, there's no problem.
Do Do you know if this is like golden absorbent ground?
I don't know about the golden absorbent ground. What is that? Is that for watercolor? There's probably similar products for watercolor, for sure. Okay, I'm not going to do the whole thing because I just want you guys to get the idea of what these products are. By the way, was the hairdryer very loud?
No, it was fine.
Okay.
Terry says his brother paints the watercolor ground on stretched canvas panels.
Right.
And then watercolors on them.
Yeah, right. It's designed for all kinds of little things. It doesn't have to be watercolor paper in itself. Okay, I'm spreading that out. Now, of course, you can imagine that there's already a blue sky on that, right? And so I made the tree too round. I should have, yeah. So I made the tree too round, and then I block this area in with this ground to replace the sky. So we'll just use, let's say, okay, so there's a question that I caught with the corner of my eye where it says, isn't hot press less absorbent than cold press paper? Correct. Hot press really does not have a utility for watercolor. It's basically used for inks. The watercolor papers, the popular ones are cold press and rough. With rough paper, the fibers are more open and therefore this pigment will seep deeper in there and it's harder to get out. With the cold press, the fibers start to close in a little bit more. They're still open, but not as much. And hot press is like this. So you need to consider that. If rough paper is probably not a very good idea if you are going to do areas that are very sensitive, such as a portrait, where you have the risk that you might have to make those corrections. Okay, I'm going to turn this back on again. What's that, Jude?
When you're spreading out the ground, are you using a touch of water too?
No, right out of the pot, the jar.
Is your brush dry?
Yes, without water. Yeah, you don't want to dilute it. So let's just say I'm going to take some cerulean and glaze over that. See how it goes right on there.
Do you think you could tint the ground first?
I don't see the point of tinting the ground first. Picked up some of that paint there. I'm working, I think this is Fabriano, and Fabriano is very, very little absorbent at all. Anyway, you can see that you can paint on there.
Okay, you got 3 questions in a row. Can you thin this ground with water to make it smoother?
You could do that if you are thinking, if you don't want the paper to be that absorbent, but I don't think it's designed for that. I don't see the purpose behind that. I think that the easiest thing is just to use it right out of the jar and period. Okay, so there you go. And then you can go back in here and then probably reestablish some of the darks of your tree and so on and so forth, right?
Does the weight of the paper make a difference?
No. The weight of the paper is irrelevant. That only makes a difference when it comes to buckling. But for that, I have this wonderful contraption. As you can see here, it's called a Gorilla Watercolor Board. And it has half sheets and 1/4 sheets. And you can see that these screws, they press, there's some grooves in the board, and this presses the paper down, and there's no buckling whatsoever with this paper, with this board, the paper with the board.
Don is asking, how is this different than gouache?
Gouache is another way to correct, but sometimes if you're going to put this into a watercolor contest, you will have problems if you incorporate another medium. So as long as you stay within the purity of watercolor, you can get away with it. I find it also has a use for, and I'm going to demonstrate this, for actually creating texture for trees. Here, let me just quickly demonstrate. Like you just put it randomly.
Samson is asking, you said that hot press was for paint.
Hot press is for inks, not for watercolor. It doesn't, the watercolor doesn't stay on the paper. You can put one layer on, but you can't glaze over. You can't put another layer, just lift the second layer off. Not very good. Probably not giving it enough time to dry, but I don't want you guys sitting there just waiting. Normally in your studio, you make sure it sits there for a while.
Judy is asking, Copic white or bleed proof white? I'm not sure what the question is.
I'm using the half-size Gorilla board. I have a full size in my studio, but I'm not using that right now.
Janice is asking, would you have to go over the whole sky again so it doesn't bloom?
Yeah, I'm just showing an option, just a little spot, right? But normally you'd put the sky in first, you put the tree on, you make a mistake, you come back and you negative paint, and then you put the white where that part of the sky was, and then I have to show you another technique where you wet this part of the sky and you leave this dry so that the pigment doesn't have a double layer. That's one of my techniques, and I'm going to show you soon. Okay, so here, this has a really neat, it's not really a correction device for this, but it's really good for painting because, first of all, it breaks up your paint nicely. As you can see, look at that brush skipping there. And you can see like little texture accumulating there. There, so that would just be like an autumn tree. I'll just quickly put some branches in there. But it breaks up the paint nicely. So, one thing that oils, and I've shown this many times with the super heavy gesso, you can prepare your board ahead of time and add a lot of super heavy gesso by crisscrossing, and you get like broken up paint. But now you can get that same effect in watercolor, that because it's a little bit bulky when you drag. As you saw, I dragged my brush over it using the belly of the brush. In other words, I used this bottom part of the brush. And as I did that, that part hit the ground, the watercolor ground, and it broke up the paint nicely. But you can also see it automatically forms highlights. See over here, getting a highlight because it absorbs the watercolor a little bit, whereas the paper absorbs more. So you automatically, by doing trees like that, you get highlights. All right. Okay. Here's another secret weapon. It's called lifting preparation. So let's say you're doing a portrait and the eyes are very sensitive, where you have chances of making a mistake in watercolor. Like, I admire all the portrait artists that actually do paintings in watercolor or pet portraits, because it's, there's no undoing. But the eyes is risky. So if we had this preparation directly without with a dry brush, don't wet your brush with water. Okay, we go like this. You put that over the entire face of your portrait. This puts like a little protective film on your watercolor paper, but still allows it to absorb more. Enough anyway. Wait till it dries, or dry it with the hair dryer. I like the look of that. See, let me zoom in with the camera. You can see that tree looks pretty cool. See the highlights coming out automatically. Okay, hit that with the dryer. Sorry about all the noise. It allows some of the bleeding, yes. You have to experiment with it to see how far you can go, but the product exists. Okay, so let's take the same pigment. Let's take Hooker's Green is very staining. And that's another thing you want to learn what pigments are staining. I have a list there for you. So we're going to go like this. This part has the preparation. This part doesn't. So we're going to go half and half. And let's see if it actually works.
When you have a moment, can you show the label on that Winsor Newton product again, please?
Lifting preparation. Now, I don't know if a hair dryer can make a difference. Maybe it solidifies it more. I don't know if it's better just to let it dry by itself or use the hair dryer. Might bake it a little bit, who knows? But let's see what happens. So if I just drag my brush through this, and then lift that off, let's see if it's true. Spray it a little bit more. Probably didn't put it on thick enough, but it does make a difference. Now I've used the most staining pigment. Hooker's Green is the most staining pigment. So if you were to do a portrait, it wouldn't be Hooker's Green. You'd be using your burnt siennas. And so let's do another one with the burnt sienna and let's say raw sienna and see what we end up with. And put a little bit more on it. Thicker amount. I'm sure that the burnt sienna and the raw sienna will come off completely. So I'm dipping, making it sort of wet. Maybe I didn't put enough on. Still, it makes a difference, right? You're getting about 50% more off it.
Would you say there's an advantage to using the lifting preparation compared to gum arabic?
Gum arabic is just what is a body that they use to dilute the pigment. It's not really much of an advantage as far as lifting paint up is concerned. This should be working better. See, I'm using the hair dryer too, so we would have to try this without the hair dryer. Okay, so let's say burnt sienna, raw sienna. This part, let's say this is like the flesh tone, right? About that same value. That's about right. Sorry about all the noise. Maybe I should just turn this up, but keep my finger on the button. Okay, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay.
Constance is saying your bottle looked kind of old. Does it age well?
That's possible. I don't know. It doesn't have an expiry date on it, but that might have something to do with it. It is very old, I must admit. I didn't consider that. I look at labels when it comes to food, but not to this.
Would there be an advantage to using this over masking fluid?
Well, masking fluid is not designed to lift off. Like, how are you going to protect the eyes? If I put masking fluid around the eyes, you're going to get a hard edge. So I would put this over the entire face area and then paint on top of that. Yeah, well, that's working the same. You know what? You're right. It could be just old. But anyway, burnt sienna comes off completely. It also could be the paper, because this paper here is, let's try this. This paper is from Fabriano. Is very compressed paper. So it's easier to lift paint up, which is another important thing to consider, is what paper are you using for these corrections? Because, like I said, Fabriano is less absorbent than Arches. One thing for sure, you can't tell the difference when you apply it. Maybe I should apply it thicker too. Like you can't see that it's on there. It's invisible completely. Now I'm using the two easiest pigments to remove, which is burnt sienna and raw sienna. Here goes the sound again. Well, it's Winsor & Newton's product, so probably a fresh flask of this. The product has to deliver what they're saying, right? Yeah, that comes off completely. Did I go over that? Anyway, that's the product anyway. Even though the demonstration is not doing it 100%, it did it with this though. Maybe because it's just so easy to remove. Okay, let's do our next way of correcting something. I'll put the lid back on this. Oh. That must have been a long time there, Sarah. Okay. We've got this watercolor here, and what I did is I applied masking painter's tape here and removed that. Now this has packaging tape. You can see there I'm removing it. I put that on before the demo. And so let's say, oh, these rocks are too brown. I don't like them. They got muddy on me. So I can take one of these precision knives and carefully cut out the highlights of these rocks. say, well, I need them to have more light. So peel that off. It's hard to see because it's so transparent. In fact, I was just thinking that you don't even have to frame a watercolor. You can just put this, you can put like a plastic film on it. You can't even tell, right? It looks like it's behind glass. So if you put, this is the new thing, but if you take this packaging tape and you put strips on it, you can probably just frame it like that without the glass. And there won't be as many reflections. Anyway, I'm not going to do the whole rock area. I'm just going to prove my point. So there, I cut that out. Make sure you have a brand new precision knife, because if it's a little bit dull, it's not going to work well. Here, let me just take this little part off here. You got to hear that a little bit of a scraping noise. You know you're cutting successfully. So this is brand new. There, just peel that off. There you go. And then what we do is, depends how stubborn the pigment is. We can use our water pick, or we can use just an ordinary spray bottle. Like, this is the way I would go step by step this way. I would go, number one, first, I would spray it. And so the idea is to not disturb the sizing, because this is cotton fibers. And in order for the pigment not to seep totally into the fibers and sit on top, they add like a sizing. So pretend you have like a towel, let's say a t-shirt, a cotton t-shirt. And then you add carpenter's glue on top of that. Or maybe a very thin layer of, ordinary house paint. So that's going to partially block the fibers for the water to go in, right? So that's what they do with this paper. So Fabriano, for example, has a lot of the sizing, so most of the pigment sits right on top, which explains how this came out so easily. Rough paper has less sizing, so the pigment will go deeper into the fibers. So step number one is I would first spray the area without rubbing it with sponges and things like that. In other words, a sponge should be, or the magic eraser should be your last option. Okay, so that's sort of helping. Oh, by the way, use one of these Jetstream water bottles, professional spray bottle you get at Home Depot. Make sure it's got a strong, in fact, I'm going to close the nozzle a little bit more to make it even more powerful.
What kind of tape do you use, Josh?
What's that?
What kind of tape?
Any plastic tape, any plastic wrapping tape, but I would get a cheap quality so it doesn't stick too much to the paper. Probably a dollar store option would be better, because if it's too good, then you might rip the paper. Okay, so that really it got rid of some of it. Like if you compare that with that, I got my highlights back on my rocks. Now, step number two, to disturb the sizing the least possible, if you want to remove more, you use a Q-tip. And see how that works. That removes a little bit more. And if that doesn't work, you go to step three. This will disturb it. This could damage the paper a little bit. You use a magic eraser from Mr. Clean. And that will definitely remove more pigment, as you can see right now. And try to do it the least possible. So there we got our highlights back. The advantage of using that clear tape is I can designate a specific area. Like, let's say over here, I ended up with this being too dark. I couldn't distinguish the difference between the light and the side. So I can paint over that and create my barnwood. So that was very successful. And even if it has a little bit of the residue on there, it doesn't matter. But you can see how well that came off and how neatly you can cut around that. Right, I can do more of these rocks, but that works very well. And then you remove the tape and you paint over it. It's pretty easy. That's the end of this painting, by the way. I sacrificed the painting for the common good. There, we got another. There we go. So that's pretty cool, right? That was very successful. Okay, let's do another neat little demonstration here. Oh, what happens when you want to soften edges? So let's say, I always say that watercolor, you should always have wet on wet effect somewhere, no matter what watercolor it is, whether it's a still life, a landscape, a pet portrait, anything. Watercolor should have bleeding edges somewhere. Preferably, my strategy is every time I create a background, I'll have soft edges. Now, this painting I did many, many, many years ago, probably 20 years ago. So I realized that the evergreen trees are too hard edged. So the way out of that is just, how do you soften an edge that's already been painted? You just use your cotton swab for that. Wait, I should wet it first. Well, remember, the scrubber brush is the last thing that you want to use, because if you're going to paint over, it's going to disturb the paper, and you're going to get an effect that's going to look like it's patched up. Of course, I have my ultimate solution for any of that, but I'm holding on to that for a little bit later.
And again, what you're showing are just examples. It's not your preferred way all the time, correct?
Well, my preferred way is not to make mistakes.
Very good. Touché.
But we all do, right? So no, I use that masking tape a lot to do corrections. Like, for example, a tree could go too far, whatever. The masking tape, the clear tape works really well in most cases. The lifting preparation, I don't really see that much use for it for landscapes, because it would only be very highly sensitive areas. So, but yeah, I can see the application in portraits. Okay, so you can see now that I'm achieving a wet on wet effect without having done that, just by using the cotton swab. See, now it's starting to bleed, and the more you do it, the more it bleeds. Now, of course, this is without incorporating gouache. Gouache, of course, is going to solve a lot of problems, but I'm not going to demonstrate that in this tutorial because that's a given, right? So I'm trying to show you ways to correct watercolor being a Puritan. So it does stand up to the scrutiny of a judge. See, there it is. That worked much better. Okay, so that's one way to correct. Now, let's say you get, let me see down my list to make sure I'm covering everything here. Okay, we did the water pick. Okay, yeah, about color mixing. I'll put this up for you so you can see.
Can you take a couple of questions?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, all the time.
I've been using frog tape to mask around my loose watercolor paper, but I've been having a lot of bleeding under the tape.
Right.
Do you have any tips to avoid the bleeding?
Use the Gorilla watercolor board. You'll never have that problem. Unless, what do you want to do? You want to create a nice crisp edge that when you peel off the tape, it looks really good?
That's how I'm reading it, Joe.
Yeah? Yeah, I like doing that too. You have like a liner. Like you do the watercolor, you put the tape around it, you peel it off, and then you can frame it, but you have a little liner like that. I think masking tape works the best. I wouldn't use painter's tape for that. I think frog tape is painter's tape. It doesn't have enough glue on it, so it does find its way inside. A good 3M masking tape, I've seen that it doesn't bleed under it. Unless there's already a previous layer on. The only time I've seen that fail is when you do a seascape, right? And you want to have a nice straight horizon line. and then you put the masking tape on that between the sky and the seascape, and I have noticed that the water goes under it and it does create problems. Okay, so the best thing, one of the most common problems with watercolor is over mixing that creates mud. And I put a little paragraph there for you. So of course, even though this tutorial is about correcting watercolors, but how about avoiding the mistakes would probably be something more of a treasure for you to learn. So in order to avoid mud, try to go for 2 pigments. And if not, then the third one. But once you put the fourth one in, now you're running a tremendous risk of ending up with mud. So if, let's say, you don't get the mixture right away, the best thing is to spray it on your palette and start over and use the 3 pigments. Okay, so I'm going to show you a technique that I use for painting, foliage, etc. Let me just get this. Okay, so we have someone here in the group that's taking notes of everything. Her name is Cindy. So it's going to be very nicely done with bullet points. All that paragraph that I just put up there is going to be in your notes, plus the screenshots of the demo, step-by-steps. And you can get that PDF if you register for the Paint Along 73 that's starting this Saturday. And you will be able to download that. We'll put that into your Artist Network account. Okay, so this is I did this little demo, and so let me put. I'm going to remove the sheet of paper. This is a block. Okay. Let me get rid of that paragraph now. Okay, so we got that. Okay, so here's my palette, and I'm going to show you how we mix. The best way to mix the paints. A little bit of a credential boasting here. I used to live in Mexico, and Mexico was the only country in those times that had an actual watercolor museum. And so they had big shows and international shows. And I was fortunate enough to win the first place in the entire country with watercolor in around the 90s. I'm just saying that so you can see that what I'm teaching you has some value. So here's how I would recommend that you mix your paints. Let's say we use raw sienna. You put a little puddle there. Okay. Actually, this is a very good secret, a very good technique here. Rinse your brush. See, Cindy's going to put that step by step. Rinse your brush. Then we're going to take Hooker's Green. Rinse your brush. Hit it. Rinse your brush. Hit it on the towel. I'm going to put burnt sienna in there. Rinse your brush. A little bit more raw sienna. It's a little bit weak here. So let's say with those 3 colors, I'm going to create a tree. So what you do, the next secret is intermingle them 50%. Like that. Don't overmix them. That way you won't get mud. Now, I'm not really mixing the paints. I'm intermingling them. When I said about using 2 pigments, that means to get to a certain color. So let's say you don't have orange. So you use, let's say, yellow and red to get orange. But this is different than varying or variegating my colors for my foliage. That's a different strategy. Long as I don't mix them, I'm intermixing. I mean, letting them just touch each other. See, they're just bleeding together. So let's do this technique. So now what happens here is that these colors are coming right off my brush, And as I load, I can adjust. See, and I get a rainbow of colors, so you don't avoid monochromatic colors. I'm going to make a mistake here. I'm going to purposely put a circle in there, right smack in the middle. Now, when it comes to foliage, of course, the best option is to use rough paper. You'll get a broken up effect. That's really, really nice. So I got that donut hole in there. It's really bothering us, isn't it? Sometimes you don't even notice it. Oh no, I created a donut hole. Now what am I going to do? Joe's techniques to the rescue. You're going to like this, watercolorists. I should have left... Okay, anyway. So you can see the variation of color happening, right? Like a rainbow. Note how I'm not drawing like with a pencil. I'm using the belly of the brush. I'll leave that there because, oh, I just noticed that donut hole. How am I going to, oh, what, that's so terrible. What am I going to do about that? And now that we're at it, how about we provoke a background? You know, we all know what that background is, right? I'm really messing it up now. Anyway, you can see before I messed it up with those backgrounds, you can see that I was able to create a variation of color. Now, when you get a background like that, the initial thing that most people do is they grab a paper towel and they dab it. Don't do that. All you need to do is just add more pigment to it. So that's how you solve a background. Just flood it with more paint. And preferably, if you have a little bit of the opaque paint, like maybe Naples yellow. See, by doing that, all I'm doing is I'm just adding more pigment to the water so it doesn't have that background. And then spread it out a tad. Now that is in case you catch the background as you're working. Now some backgrounds are actually good, depending, like if you have them in the field, I provoke them. I do a grass field and I take my brush and I splatter and they look like weeds that are forming. But in trees, they're really ugly. So I'm going to make a few mistakes here. I've been teaching for a long time and I know exactly where artists tend to weaken some of their areas of their paintings.
What is the definition of a background?
Background means that you add water to an area that's damp and it expands it. It's also called the blossom. Okay, let's put another little bush over here or something, just so we have two different sides of the tree. Okay, we're gonna leave these little ugly things forming there that we goofed up because the brush started to drip as I put that in there. Oh no, this whole thing is a disaster. I can't get out of it anymore. Jeez. Okay, so okay, as you can see, I was able to save this background there by adding more pigment to it. It filled it in very nicely as if nothing happened. And that was the worst one. This one cured pretty nicely too. This one, I didn't add anything to it. So that's like creeping up on you, like, looks like a spider coming at you, right? So we might have to fix that. But anyway, as you can see, because I mixed the pigments on my palette like 50%, we're getting all these variations of color. But I still have that donut hole. So how am I going to get out of that one? And here's the solution to that. I'm going to make it, you know, like an invisible suture. If you know how that works, right? With a tailor. Okay, so step number 1 is wet the entire area that you want to fix. Now this is on cold pressed Arches paper. Okay, now scrub it out. Once you do that, scrub it out. In other words, destroy the hard edge. Oh, it wasn't dry yet. I rushed it. I thought it was dry. See, I'm time sensitive here. Okay, well let's produce it again then. Let me just hit that one. Anyway, I'm going to do all kinds of mistakes here. I've seen a lot of this in a lot of my students' work. They go back on this and they start to add like little leaves right on top. Instead of leaving, because they're, you know, we artists think in terms of, oh, a tree is a lot of leaves. So we start adding a lot of leaves everywhere, thinking that that's going to make it look more like a tree. And what happens is it becomes overworked when you do that.
Patricia is asking, what if the background is on the edge of a painted area and you don't want to add more paint?
I'll show you the solution to that. In other words, here, let me just put this donut hole back in there. Okay, that really got muddy on us, and I've seen this a lot. Like I keep telling my students, don't go back on there. If you want to change the color of the tree, instead of poking at it on top and creating, I call these scabs. It's not really a name that is well known, but I call it scabs. It overworks it. The best thing is to re-wet the entire tree and then drop the paint in rather than push it on with a brush. Okay, that tree is terribly overworked. It's got a nice shape to it, though. Just overworked. Okay, so here's the secret. You spray with a mist bottle. Just a ordinary mist bottle. I have this one from a hairdresser. Very fine mist. So in other words, whenever you're going to glaze over something to darken it, unless you're negative painting, always spray the area first and then work on top of the water. You won't get these little scabs. Okay, so I'm going to spray that. Then what you do is you clear out, you get rid of the hard edge of that hole. You can dab it then. Yeah, you're not trying to remove the pigment from there. You're just trying to get rid of that hard edge. That's all you want. Make it nice and soft edge there. Dry it. Sure it's dry. Okay, now here's the idea. With clear water, I'm going to make that disappear. With clear water, you wet around that donut hole, not inside the donut hole. Because if I glaze over that, what I'm going to get is this becomes darker and that just stays lighter, and it's going to be too obvious. You can't just glaze over to fix that. I think everybody that's worked with watercolor, they know this. So you wet around that hole, not inside the hole. Spread it around. Let that absorb a little bit, but because it's, I'm rushing it here, I'll just go ahead and do it. And then what you do is you fill the inside part of the hole, which is dry, with the same color mixture. Let it hit the water. Make a few adjustments. I can make that look invisible. And then spread it around. Let it just hit the water. And there you go. That covers it. That happens a lot. Things that you don't like. See? It practically is invisible. Now I've got an overworked tree, and I did that on purpose, because I have another secret weapon for that. So let's say you do have an overworked tree. Let me just get my tray of pan pastels. The next secret weapon is something that's called pan pastels. Some of you have seen this already, but these two are so compatible, it's incredible. They're so compatible. So all I have to do is I can go on top of this and I can fix anything that seems to be overworked. Look how beautiful that is now.
After dry, correct?
Yes, never wet. So I get rid of all those little scabby areas. And you can't even tell. I remember the first time I did this, I put this in the hands of another watercolor artist, and I said, do you see anything weird here? It wasn't even framed. It was just a pure paper. Do you see anything different? And no, he said, no, I don't see anything different. It's watercolor, right? I said, yeah, but do you see anything that's not watercolor? He said, no. Well, guess what? It's got pastels on it. Really? He says to me, yeah. Now I can change the colors if I want. Now watch, this is even more cool. I can paint over that. Look, I can add more of a glow. So now we got a fresh looking tree. And it doesn't look like you added the second medium. No difference at all. And the neat thing about it is I can go in there and I can paint over that. Let's do that. Now in this case, I don't have to wet it first because it has a purpose. See, if I attempt, let's say it's too monochromatic and I want to change the color, you wet it first. But in this case, I'm not going to wet it because I'm negative painting to create render a 3D image of this tree. So you can paint into the pan pastels. Whatever you don't like, you can erase it. There's only one brand. It's called Pan Pastels. Pan Pastel, actually. I pluralize it, but it's not pluralized according to the manufacturer. Don't subdivide too many times.
You don't need to use a fixative.
No. That's why Pan Pastels is so... I'll give you a description about it in a minute. I'll tell you a little bit about the medium. So let me just finish the little demo here. Let's make this dark. All right. And a little bit too hard-edged here, so put... There. We got ourselves a tree now that looks professional. It doesn't look overworked. It doesn't look muddy. And I can, like I said, I can come back with different colors and change it. I can add a little bit of orange there if I want to. What you don't want to do is glaze on top. You can't glaze on top with watercolor. You can only go darker on top. If you want to change it, then you just go to another pan pastel, another color like orange, and add that to it. Whatever you don't like, you erase it. No, pan pastels doesn't bleed. It's always going to be hard-edged. But you can always come back and do this. Let's say this is getting a little bit too hard-edged there. Let me dry it. You like that, Olivia? That is a really cool weapon. Okay, so all I need to do is just caress that a little bit, you know, putting very little, just feather over that pan pastel, and I'll soften that edge.
Have you ever tried a UV fixative spray on your watercolor paintings to make them more light fast?
There's controversy about that. The manufacturers say that it's totally not going to happen during your lifetime, not with the new pigments, but yet the Metropolitan Museum of Art keeps their watercolors in the basement where there is no sunlight, and they take it out so many times a year. They're not always exposed to light. And I think that's because they're very old. But according to the manufacturer, the duration of the pigments will be centuries anyway, so I wouldn't worry about it. Nobody's going to outlive the watercolor. Now, I can go back with the pan pastel and let's say fill in little areas here, put some leaves. You really can't tell, right? There's no way you can tell that that's been patched up with this pastel. Now, the reason why the pan pastels work so well, I mean, another option is just to use stick pastels, but you can notice that. That's a giveaway. Why isn't it scabby, Susan? Because the pan pastel is semi-opaque and I covered it. Now, this is not scabby because what I'm doing here is I'm not putting that dark on top of a highlight. I'm negative painting, so I'm leaving large areas. The trick when it comes to foliage is leave these large areas of solid foliage and not just fill it all in. This does look scabby here. Sure, it's going to look scabby there, but it's designated scabbiness where the dark would be. It's different than taking this and going everywhere and going over the whole entire tree. So it's premeditated or designed negative painting. There's no other way to do a tree anyway with watercolor. Okay. And then you look how I added the shine over here.
Have you tried applying alcohol with the pan pastel?
No, it doesn't work. Okay, now the reason why this works over, I mean, the stick pastels, you can do that too, but you're going to see the graininess, and it's going to be a giveaway. The pan pastels, the pigments are so pulverized, like talcum powder. It's so, there's no little sand, little areas, little sand, little grains. It's all been into a very fine powder. That's why you need this applicator for that. So if you really think about it, let's say the original pigment of this chromat oxide green also exists in oils. It's the exact same pigment. There is no such thing as a pigment that's designated to watercolor or designated to oils or acrylics. Burnt sienna is the same in all the mediums. What changes is the body in which hosts the powder, the pigment, right? So in case of oils, let's say you use walnut oil or you use linseed oil or poppy seed oil. This has a different body. They don't reveal that. It's like Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's their secret. They don't want competitors. But ultimately, when you put the watercolor pigment on there and it evaporates, you still end up with the same thing. You still have pigment on there, which is this. That's why you can't tell the difference. Okie doke. Cool. This for me is my favorite way of correcting anything. Now, I had to fix that circle anyway, because by putting this on there, it would have still been noticeable because it's not 100% opaque. It's like 50% opaque. No, sorry, it should be 80% opaque. So you still have to fix it. But then you can go back on there and you can't even tell what I did. And if you get, here's another solution. Let's say I get too dark. Here, let's say I really go too far and make my accents unnecessarily too dark, which is another thing that happens very often in watercolor because you really don't know what color is going to dry sometimes. All I have to do is just use this. Let's say that's, just for argument's sake, that's watercolor, right? All you have to do is just, one way to fix too dark of a watercolor is just to find the same pigment with pan pastels and just go on top. Here, I'll do it here, actually, provoke it. So let's go, this is a Prussian blue and it's really dark here. So that's sticking out like a sore thumb, right? So, oh no, I went too dark. What am I going to do? Well, just simply take your pigment and just, your pan pastels, and go over that. And that'll bring it to, let's say, a value 7, 10 being black, and so it doesn't stand out so much. And you can just keep adding. In the worst case, if that still doesn't work, then you resort to the stick pastels, but then you're going to notice that. But I can see I can put little corrections here and there. Still think it's a little bit too dark. There. So that works well, doesn't it? That probably was worth your time just to pop into this YouTube video, just that one thing in itself. Okay, another secret weapon. No, you don't need 2 mats to frame. Pan pastels, the powder is so fine it doesn't fall. Okay, I'll prove that. If I go like this, right? Theoretically, in a normal pastel, if I tap this, or I'm going to make no... here. Oh. I tapped the painting on top of this, and you can see there is no residue of pastels. It's something that you can't do with the stick pastels. So no, you don't have to frame it with a double mat. Okay. We have this painting here. And I didn't get enough white water in there. What am I gonna do? I don't see the white water. This didn't really work out that well. Ta-da! Dremel. Cool. Or you can make it go faster. Dentists. Okay. So that you get the splashy water, so you can use it for crashing foam for seascapes, for texture on barnwood. I can add maybe just a few touches on my rocks here and there. Just see, I got a little bit of texture there. Or I can use sandpaper as well. So let's say you have an area that's really stubborn, right? That you really don't want. You can use sandpaper like this, which is very fine. Go in there like this and sand it off. And then use what we saw very successfully, the watercolor ground. I don't even think you need to do it with sandpaper anyway. But let's just say it's very stubborn and you want to get it out of there. This is a tool. It's called Dremel. You get it at Home Depot. You guys want to go buy it, right?
And do you use it over 140-pound arches paper?
The paper doesn't matter. It doesn't go. The paper's thick enough. It won't go through it. Yeah, it does mess up the paper, the surface of the paper. That's going to be your last resort, right? So obviously, I'm not going to paint over that. I'm going to leave it as it is. Unless, of course, I feel like I went too far, then I can put this back on there and fix it. So I can clean that off with sandpaper totally, right? Soften it, add my ground, and then paint over it again. You just keep going back and forth. And still, it's a Puritan watercolor. You already have a Dremel. There you go, Kenya. Okay. What's my next? It's also good to know, we can do, if we have time, we can do a little seascape, a little crashing wave demo with that and how I use it. Sorry, my seat cracks. I bought a new one and it still does it, so. Okay, here we have a classification of the different pigments, and we're going to do an experiment together and see which ones are staining. So it's good to know which pigments are staining and non-staining. The staining ones are more stubborn to remove. As we saw with burnt sienna, it's very easy to remove. Hooker's green, I have found it's one of the most difficult ones, as well as alizarin crimson is very difficult as well. So I'm going to just run a brush through that and wipe it off and see what we get. So that also means that you can mix certain, again, if you're in a sensitive area where you're concerned about you might make a mistake, you can, instead of using a pre-mixed orange, for example, you can use a transparent yellow and permanent rose and get the same color, knowing that you can remove that. So let's go through the list. Just go over that one more time. A little bit of scrubbing helps. Let that sit in there a little bit to loosen up the pigment. Now we're going to scrub it, and we see what we end up with. Ooh, you can see cadmium orange is very difficult. Oops, I carry that other color in there.
Which paper is this on, Joe?
This is Daler-Rowney paper. Okay, as you can see, raw sienna is very easy to remove. Cadmium yellow a little bit more difficult. Transparent yellow is very easy to remove. So something to consider. Besides, you should be using transparent yellow rather than cadmium yellow anyway, because cadmium yellow has some white in it, transparent yellow doesn't. It's a very pure color. Burnt sienna is really easy to remove. Now we can keep going, but there's going to be a point. Let me see how much I can actually take away completely from all that.
Do you still use alizarin crimson, or have you changed to permanent rose?
I use permanent rose. So if we start to scrub that, that's the real test when you scrub it. Ultimately, it's not the line that counts, it's how much you can actually remove. Cerulean blue seems to be weak. That's interesting. Winsor Newton mentions cadmium orange as a non-staining color, and I totally disagree. It's the most difficult one to remove. You can see Hooker's green and sap green are pretty stubborn. Also, permanent rose is stubborn. Cobalt blue is easy to remove. Windsor violet is very stubborn. Asked my wife, she tried to get some of it out of a shirt the other day. No way. So as you can see, it's very difficult to completely remove them, that's why you need to resort to other systems, like the water pick will get rid of more of that. The magic eraser will do more. So you start to scrub that, but cadmium orange is so stubborn. Raw sienna, you can completely remove raw sienna. That there is the paper peeling off now. That's not very desirable, because when you get that, I mean, you watercolorists, you know this, right? As soon as you start to rub it with a sponge, you're going to get this peeling off, which is the paper. And when you go on top, you're going to notice that. That's why I would recommend that when that happens, you put a layer of this on, so that you sort of like restore the paper to a point. And I guess you have to experiment how much you can do it with the wet paper or not. How much of it has to be dry. But I'm sure that when you add this to it, it will restore that softness of the paper. The Dremel tip, just anyone. It really doesn't matter, Sam. This is like not a very coarse sandpaper, but I find this very useful for crashing waves. Okay, so let me just see which one gets more stubborn here.
Can you use a Dremel tool on the acrylic once it's dry?
Yeah, but then acrylics is easier. Just go right on top, right? That's an opaque medium. That's pretty simple. Now, if this was on Arch's rough paper, that would even be much more difficult to remove. Whereas with what's the name of this one now? Fabriano, it's very easy to remove because, again, there's some more sizing on it. So if I do this, you can see I can probably get rid of a lot of it. See? That comes off almost completely. The only disadvantage of that is, yes, it's better for correcting. So let's say if you want to do a portrait, you probably want to consider using Fabriano because then you can wipe it off and correct it. But the problem is it doesn't have much grain on it, so you don't get a broken up effect for like a dry brush effect for trees. Whereas the Arches rough paper is excellent for dry brush effect. Okay, let's do another stage is the wet on wet, because in the list of things for watercolor, we spoke about controlling wet on wet. Of course, I ended up with a terrible looking thing there now, but it's all in the idea of teaching you. I also have this handy eraser. This is an electric eraser for removing pencil marks. It does the best job. Derwent. So when you finish your watercolor, some people don't like the pencil marks. So if you spin that and you very precisely go over the pencil mark, this removes it better than anything else. And it really doesn't remove that much of the actual watercolor paint. Okay, so let's do a few watercolor experiments as far as wet on wet control. How does that sound?
One question on the watercolor ground, does it last a long time? Well, does it dry out in the jar?
I don't know. I can't tell you that. Oh, in the jar? I've had this for 8 years. I thought you meant on the paper. I've had this at least 8 years, and I opened it today for the first time in I don't know how long. Maybe last time I demonstrated this, but at least in 2 years I haven't opened it. And it's pasty. It's perfect. Doesn't dry out.
And will you be talking about your new upcoming course?
Yeah, we can do that very quickly. I got let me see. Yeah, the tutorial is not over, by the way. I'm just putting this in because you asked. It's not over. So it says, thanks for watching this tutorial. It looks like I'm signing off. I'm not yet. But the next course is about, my painting is evolving, and it should be evolving. I shouldn't be stuck in one kind of style where I'm exaggerating. I've come to the conclusion that you can't copy nature anyway because nature is a macro world and things tend to be monochromatic, too gray. So a lot of us professional artists, we add more color to our scenes, but I'm going to take it the next step. I'm going to go even further and exaggerate colors to push it a little bit beyond the average looking and make it more, a little bit more into the abstract side, a kind of a landscape painting idea where not abstract in abstract art, but in the sense that the rocks, for example, would have more purples and blues in them. Water would be more brilliant. Like instead of like a dull kind of blue, I'm going to add more punch to it. And so the three classes are coming up, especially the watercolor one is going to be a Greek scene with a street scene with cast shadows. We're going to throw all kinds of color in those cast shadow, oranges and pinks and blues and violets. So I'm going to use a lot of violet in my landscapes to see how far I can push it. And so I think you're going to learn a lot to take your paintings out of the ordinary, especially if you have a tendency of just copying photos or trying to strive to make things look real. There's more information about that on artistnetwork.com. Artistnetwork.com. Just click on the right on the front page. There's a painting of mine with Johannes there. Paint along. Click on that, and that will open the whole description of the next course that starts this Saturday, as a matter of fact. Okay, after that little commercial break. Okay, so obviously, when I did this thing about wiping out this evergreen trees and giving them a soft edge that weren't there before, right? The idea is to avoid that. So if I had better control of wet on wet in those days, I wouldn't have had that hard edge there. So the idea is to let's learn a few ways to control our wet and wet paint. Okay, so let's think in terms of the paper is a sponge and your brush is a sponge because they both absorb water, correct? So we're not going to think in terms of brushes or paper, but of two different absorbing surfaces. As long as your paper is more wet than your brush sponge, you will have wet on wet control. The moment that your brush has more water than the paper, you've lost your control. I'm going to prove that. I put this as a sponge so that you'd remember it. Okay, I can wet the paper. You know what? Let me do a little, how about I do like a little crashing wave demonstration for you. We still got time. I want this to end at 3 o'clock, so we're good. That way you can see like a little demo of a painting too. Not a full painting, just an area. I'm using one of these blocks here. It's always cumbersome to peel off that first layer. That's why I don't like these blocks. You don't need these blocks if you got the Gorilla watercolor board. Look at Murphy's Law here. Oh, come on, there it is. Yeah. They're not even worth the money anyway. Okay, so we'll set that there. Zoom in a bit. Okay, so first I'm just going to do this, and okay, so the way you know that you're controlling your wet on wet enough or correctly is that you should be able to write your telephone number on the paper, and it should be legible where the little hole in the eights should be noticeable. If you're writing a letter A, you should be able to see the negative space in between it. So I'm wetting the paper. So step number 1, I'll give you step by step here. Wet the paper either lightly or soak it. If I wet the paper lightly, I'm buying less painting time for the wet on wet. So that would be good, let's say, just for a small area like these evergreen trees, right? So let's say I got a phone call, I put the sky in, I put the mountain in, I got a phone call, I had to take it from the doctor. I couldn't say, well, wait, I'm going to wait for my paper. You have to wait for to call me later because I'm doing a wet and wet technique right now. I don't think they're going to do that. But anyway, so I have to come back and re-wet it. So since this is just a little area, I can wet that lightly. Just just pass over it once and with the water. And I just need like maybe 5 minutes painting time. But let's say I'm going to do a whole skyscape on a full sheet of watercolor paper. Well, then I would have to wet that 3 times. So what I'm trying to say here is that you can never over wet the paper, but you can under wet it. If you over wet it, all you have to do is just wait longer for the water to seep into the fibers. It's a mistake to think that the water is drying. The water is not drying in your paper. It's going in between the fibers. So you can wet an area 2 or 3 times. Now take into account that a rough paper gives you more control for the wet on wet than the cold press, because the rough paper, the fibers are more open and the water deposits within those openings, goes into like seeping into the paper, like for when you make coffee. Okay. And the cold press, the fibers are closer together, and so there's less absorption of water, which makes it more difficult for you to control wet on wet. Okay, so wait for the cotton fibers to absorb the water. The sheen should fade. So one way to guarantee it is take your watercolor paper, put it up against a source of light, and if it no longer, you don't see the wet part anymore, you're probably safe to go. Now, I didn't wet it enough. I'm just going to write like some numbers and letters here, and then we do that little crashing wave demonstration. There it is. See, you want to get rid of that. That's the technique, right? See, if I try to apply wet on wet there, unless it's a very dark area, it's going to be fugitive and I won't control it. So I won't be able to leave the little donut holes inside the number 8 if I write it, which is about an inch tall. And don't try to accelerate that with a hair dryer. You're going to have problems because it dries randomly faster than other areas, and you're going to get a wrong result. So just keep waiting for that to look wet, but no sheen. Okay, in the meantime, I'll let that sit there. So you can't see it like this. You have to actually tilt it, lift up your paper. Now, the secret is the drier the pigment is here, the more control you're going to have here. The more water you have here, the less control you're going to have here. So less water, more water. Less water, more water. So that means that you add just a little bit of water on your palette, enough to push the pigment around. Just a little bit of water. Now, if I feel like it's too much because that's running, I can either hit that with the hair dryer until I get it exactly to make it pasty, and or squeeze the brush upright at the ferrule so the water runs down into my paper. Make sure your paper is damp. So now I got less water in my brush, less water in my sponge. This sponge has less water than this sponge. So even though the sheen's not gone, because I have that control, I can still write the letter in there. In fact, I took out so much. So it's just a matter, it's the ratio of how much there, because I sucked the water out. I got perfect control there. So that's one way to know if you're doing it right. In fact, let me use a smaller brush. See, this one I'm not going to suck the water out of it, and it's going to go a little bit more crazy on me. See that? I lost my control. It was the same mixture, the same amount of water, but in this case I went directly from the palette to the paper instead of doing this. So if I squeeze it here, then I'm going to have control. And I'm going to write that same number 8 now. There you go, bingo. In fact, it got too hard edged for me. See, isn't that cool? So the mistake that a lot of artists do is they keep brushing, they wash the brush in the water, and then they go back to the palette, dip it in their container, go back to the palette, they're adding more water, then they try to go here, and it goes crazy on them. Now, you can do that to a point when the sheen is gone, but there's no control whatsoever. So the secret is, after you clean your brush, dry it. There. Now I can control. So when it comes to an evergreen tree, for example, if I do that, I have control. I'm not going to lose that silhouette. So See, it's running too much, so I just keep squeezing. Or add more pigment to my mixture to make it pasty. So the idea is that this is supposed to be pasty, not runny. So it's not supposed to run. The moment it runs, I'm not going to have any control. But if it's pasty where it's wet and it doesn't run, I will have control. So if I put my little evergreen tree in here now, I have control. It's just a matter of how much. There. So I got just the right amount of, some of it fugitive, but not too much. In fact, wet on wet makes very beautiful evergreen trees because you can see like the little boughs and the cones and everything, the pine cones forming. See? Look at the difference between that and that. Pretty cool. There, now that I'm at it, I can do my whole range of trees there with perfect control. It's still going to bleed a little bit. Take into account that still, when you saw me put this initially, it looked pretty sharp, but the pigment tends to swim a little bit more. You need to consider that. So this is still going to expand a bit more, unless one way to do is just, if I like my form, grab your hairdryer, hit it quickly, as before it starts to the pigment starts to expand more. And now the figure is written in stone. That's what I call it, because once you dry it, it's not going to go anywhere. Unless, of course, you use some of my secret weapons. Okay, so let's do a quick. Let's use several of these techniques together, where I'm going to use the Dremel for some of the spray of the foam, and yet the wet and wet. So here we go. I think I've covered all my corrections. Let me just double check. Pan pastels, done that. Spray. Now, of course, the best thing is always, and I think that's just common sense, but just so we have a complete tutorial here, when I put the paint on, and let's say I don't like the color, obviously the best thing is just to hit that with the water right away, right? That goes without saying. And try not to do this. Wait, this does not go without saying. This is important. Do not do this. Don't push it in there. Like if you're trying to get rid of a pimple. Because what you're doing is you're actually pushing the pigment inside the fibers, even though you don't notice it, but it's going in there. So let it run. The best thing is to tilt it. Okay, so let me tell you the correct way to do this. So let's say I flood that, make a mistake. I should hold this upright like this, put a towel under it. Here's my towel. Okay, you can see my towel. Put that under it, and then spray it. Oops, I'll spray it so you guys can see that. Spray it and just let the paint run into your towel. Don't push it in there. There. That's the best way to do it. That way you're not disturbing any of the sizing. And you don't even have to dry it either. Sorry for that bang noise. Well, the easy lift off chemical was this, but I didn't really work that well except for Hooker's Green. I believe because the product is very old, but obviously Winsor Newton would not sell a product that doesn't work. So maybe if you just get a new container, and it should work much better. Because I remember using it years ago and it took it off completely. That I did not anticipate. Okay.
Does 300-pound paper act like rough paper?
They're supposed to be the same, but I've noticed in my experience that 300-pound paper versus 140 pounds, the 300-pound, even though they both say cold press, but the 300-pound seems to absorb more than the ordinary 140-pound. I don't know why. Maybe it's the amount of sizing that they put on it. It doesn't work as well. It works either better or worse depending on what you want, but they're not the exact same kind of paper. Theoretically, the 300-pound, the advantage is that you don't have to stretch the paper, but it still curls like a potato chip. So I don't really think it's worth the money. It's not worth the hassle. I think your best thing is just to get the Gorilla watercolor board and stretch your 140-pound. It doesn't buckle anyway, and you save yourself the money.
Susan is asking, what happens when you remove all the sizing?
I don't think you can because it goes into the fibers, but I think some of it can come off, and that also happens with you when you like if you wet it several times. But I think you can live with that because it's designed for that.
Someone is asking, what's more important, your skills or your supplies?
What's more important than what?
What is more important, your skill level or your supplies?
Skill is always going to outnumber that. Okay, we got a symmetrical shape here. So let's make it go this way. Okay, we're going to implement all these techniques, wet and wet and everything, even the Dremel for our crashing wave. Okay, let me dry this palette. Normally in my regular courses, so you know, my palette, there's the camera, instead of putting it on my face, I didn't do it today because there wasn't a lot of need to do that. But in the classes, on my regular workshops, this camera will be on my palette. So you can see me mixing at the same time, do the painting. Because right now there wasn't really any mixing, it was just how to do corrections. And that way there's no gaps there of you're not seeing anything happen. Right now I'm just cleaning it out and drying it. Okay. So let's do, okay, so the best thing is, for me, the most beautiful line, see when you look at that shape there, well, it's right now it's a mess because I played with it, but this is not desirable in a watercolor. You don't want to have, and neither is this desirable where you have all hard edges everywhere. The beauty of watercolor or any edge is to do soft, lost and found. So some of the areas should be lost, some of the areas should be found, which is what I'm going to do here. I'm going to tap this randomly. So some of that wave will bleed into the paper. That means that there's wind spraying it. There's wind creating the spray. And I'm going to have some hard edges, a mixture of both. So let's say, see, normally you'd be looking at my palette now. Let's just do like a stormy sky. See if we can throw this in a 15-minute kind of demo. Okay, so we want some of that to bleed. Maybe I should provoke mistakes on purpose so I can correct those.
When you come across old, unmarked watercolor paper, how do you differentiate what type it is?
Oh, if it's cold pressed or rough, There is a way to do the test. If you take a flat brush like this and you go like this, if it doesn't break up, like if you get a solid like 2 inches, then you know it's a rough paper. Because if I do this on cold press, that would break up. Because of the valleys, it's got the little indentations are deeper. And so, see, I'm not getting the broken up part effect. I'm getting a little bit of dry brush effect, but it's not breaking up, which means that cold press is not very good for foliage. That's why I prefer rough paper for that. Okay, so this is my crashing wave. I'm just like I'm leaving, it's just like a little bit of a vignette, right? So I spot wet it, and you can see there's a little bit of bleeding here. See, what you don't want is an entire hard edge everywhere. Because the problem with that is it looks like it was cut out, pasted on. It's a terrible effect as far as I'm concerned. Neither do you want everything soft because it's a focal point and you want the viewer's eye to focus on something. So if the eye of the wave is your focal point, the fact that you destroy all the edges makes it uncomfortable for the viewer to look at it like the viewer's putting on some glasses that don't belong to him or her. You know what? Let me provoke this background. I'm going to try all kinds of mistakes. Oh no, we got a background there. Okay, the same thing we're going to do here. Lost and found. Oh, that's a typical blossom there. Oh, no. Now what? Okay, I wanted to make sure that this was not symmetrical. And now I'm going to use, let's say, Prussian blue. Ochre's green, a little bit of red to calm it down. Now I always have, as I'm working, a little test sheet with me, like an old piece of paper, just to try it out, to make sure I got the right mixture before I hit the painting in itself. I can always do this too and make a comparison. This is a neat technique. Let's say I want to do my water, right? So if I do that, instead of painting it, it looks a little bit too dark. So I got to lighten that a tad. So I do it on the paper. Again, you avoid mistakes rather than trying to correct them. Okay, so let's see, some cerulean blue in here.
I noticed your horizon line is not straight.
Well, I'm trying to let them bleed together. Of course, the background is that the moment you do this and you put more water, see, when you get that, you start making all kinds of mistakes. When there's more water in the paper, by adding it with your brush. Yeah, why would I put this little crashing wave there? Here, I'm going to goof up.
There you go. That's what I was going to ask.
Okay, we're going to do lost and found over here. Remember, I provoked that. I could have flooded it with more pigment, but I provoked that. Remember, this is just an area. It's not the whole painting. We don't have time for that. Maybe some other day. When I give my regular online workshops, there I have time to do the whole painting from the beginning to the end. And my students help me sometimes. Can you believe that? They do. They help me by saying, sometimes I second guess and I say, shall I put these flowers on the field, or what do you guys think? Would it be too busy? And then I ask for a voting system, and then if most of them say yes, do it, then I do it. If they say, sometimes they tell me when to stop. And I listen to the backseat drivers in that sense. Stop, Joe. I want to make sure the foam is not parallel. That's the eye of the wave. Ooh, that's too round. See, here's a neat thing for some of you that maybe this is the first time you watch me. How do you know that a shape, you hear a lot of people talking about abstract shapes, asymmetrical shapes. How do you know when a shape is a good one? It's asymmetrical. When you draw an imaginary line down the middle and you compare both sides, if side A and side B are different, then chances are you have a good shape. Well, not chances are, you do have a good shape, period. I'm going to put a little bit of blue here. Now, when it comes to the edges of your painting, the edges, soothe them. Do very little, no distraction whatsoever there. Okay, so let's hit that with the dryer. I'll be done in about 10-15 minutes. No, this parts I'm leaving on purpose. Those are just fast brush strokes. There's nothing there for you to see. Look, see, it ends over here. In fact, it's zoomed out a little bit too much. I'm not respecting the borders. This is a quick swatch, just a quick demonstration of. Okay, did that all dry? Okay. Also, you got to consider that watercolor dries lighter. See, this got too light on me now. I lost the vibrancy of color. So let's hit that again with a little bit more Hooker's green. I'm purposely goofing up, okay, here and there, because I want you to see how I use different mediums and things to fix it. Okay, I'm just overworking that part. Okay, in the meantime, how do we fix this? I taught you how to do that, right? Well, that goes in there. So first thing we're going to do is wet it. Let it sit in there for about a minute. I'm not going to wait the minute, but it should be about a minute. With a Q-tip, lightly scrub and destroy the obvious edge. So in other words, there should be a gradual border line between the both of them, which I have there now. Dry it. This is a better step-by-step one, Cindy, than the other one I did. This is a better example, so if you want to include this one instead so we don't repeat. Then what was our next step? We went around it. Of course, it doesn't look bad there. It looks like it's part of the crashing wave, right? So we went around it, around the ring, put a ring around it, spread it out. So you don't get like an obvious end where you put the water. And now come in with, try to match the color as much as you can. You go inside of that. And let it go right into the water. Spread it out now with the water that you had in there. And it's gone. See how cool that is? Okay, let's continue with this wave. Melt that in there. It's easier to get backruns or blossoms when you're using cold press than rough paper because it absorbs more, you won't get as many. Display my brush like this. Display my brush like this to create this effect. Like a fan brush. That's the wave that's crashing. Okay, so we fixed this over here. Now, there are several options that we can use. We can use the, start with the Dremel thing. Let me just soften this a bit more. Okay, let's hit that with the dryer. Okay, so we can use some of these water droplets. See, that's pretty cool. And then soften it here and there. I know it reminds me of the dentist. That I should turn off the audio there. Now I can create some of these soft edges over here. That means it's the best thing is to have them mixed up, soft and hard edges. Over here I don't have any. I sort of forgot these over here. This is a very, very quick demo, by the way. It's hard to do this in just a few minutes, but here's what we call a thirsty brush, all right? So you take a thirsty brush and you wet it first, and then you go in there, and let me get a smaller one.
You want to talk about lines on the wave?
Yeah, I've come up with a notion. I say some things that are really important. I've come up with something like the way I learned is that I gave workshops. I mean, I took a lot of workshops when I was, starting out as an artist. And I realized that I wasn't getting enough information. And so I resorted to subscribing to art magazines. and I put the other artist's work under an X-ray, so to say, metaphorically, where I reverse engineered their techniques to learn why those paintings look so well. And I realized that there were common denominators that they were doing. And so I had to decipher those, and I did. Now, a lot of these artists that give these workshops, a lot of professional artists, they do things by instinct because it looks good. They do it because they know it looks good because they've done it through trial and error. But that's different than actually conveying this to the next door neighbor, to the students, right? So I've come up with 200 of their pointers of what makes their paintings tick. And I realized that one of the most important things that you can conceive is called melodic lines or graceful lines. That term does not exist outside of my workshops. That's my term that I created. But what I mean by that is the most important thing that you can create in a painting is a line. In this case, I'm calling this a graceful line because it's like a roller coaster effect. In other cases, it's what you call a melodic line. You will see more examples of those during the regular classes. Let me just go one more level darker here. Make this wave really stand out nicely. Like right in here, it would be darker. I'm almost done. But those are, once you learn that, your whole artwork will revolutionize in one session. Honestly, in one session. Tell me, my students, if I'm wrong. If they can understand the melodic line and graceful line concept, don't you agree with me that that would completely revolutionize their paintings? It gives you all the answers to the most common problems, is all in the lines and shapes, of course. But I already gave you a tip about an abstract shape. You just compare two sides. I mean, I can go on and on with this painting until I get it just right. Okay, so here we don't have a soft edge enough. Also very important is that it's the combination of hard versus soft edges. There, that's a little bit, see, this is important here. Hard edge, then soft, preferably this should be a soft edge here, but then it's a lost and found, right? So over here, you follow that. This comes into focus. Over here, this goes out of focus. That's the most beautiful line that you can create. A roller coaster effect, and then lost and found edges. I mean, there's so much to say. I can't do it in one session. But anyway, putting these little foam patterns in there, I'm almost done here.
Your brush strokes is really telling on the direction of the waves as well.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an exaggeration of an uphill there, but again, it's watercolor. It's hard to foresee everything. Again, I can implement corrections on areas I don't like. I would like to get a little bit of that over here, but then I would have to spray that out. We don't have all that time. I taught you the ways to do that. Besides, a watercolor should look a little bit cartoonish anyway. You should not, the mistake is to strive for realism. You shouldn't think in those terms. You should think in terms of cartoonish is probably the right word. We can use, let me just do a few more things and we're done. I was drawing my knee there. I was so concentrated I forgot I had it on for no reason. So it just answered me. Okay, so here you can use some fine sandpaper for, oh, let me hit that with a dryer one more time. So as you can see, I use some correction tools here. I use the Dremel for that. I use the sponge for that. Here I can use a little bit of sandpaper to create an effect here. Make it look like the wind is blowing that. This is very fine sandpaper, but you can use different grades. So that actually softens an edge as well. Also around here a bit. There, see how neat that wave came out? Another one starting here about. So if you use very fine sandpaper, you actually create the effect of wet on wet. When you get the finest you can get. So I hope you learned some really neat things. In a perfect world, this should be less symmetrical, but I rushed it. I also tell my students the parts that I feel that should have been improved. I could still fix that. It just, all I have to do is just rub that out. Let's do it since we're here anyway.
We could take pan pastels to it, Joe.
Oh, yeah, let's do that. You're right. Thanks. So you can see all kinds of options. Or in any case, you can just use ordinary pastels. Doesn't have to be pan pastels. Do you want to see that too? Do you want to see ordinary pastels? That works just as well. In this case, since we have crashing water, it doesn't matter. So I'm just going to use an ordinary stick pastel and destroy that symmetry. Or a combination of both. You've got so many options. There, and then just rub that in with your finger. There, I just got rid of the symmetry. I mean, I can go on and on until I get it just right. There, that did it. Stick pastels works very well for waterfalls. You can put a little bit of texture on them, crashing waves, so it's even preferable to use this over the pan pastels. Yeah, let me just do this. Put a little shadow sign on that. And come back with this. There we got waterfall. So you can add on other mediums. I think it's just being stubborn to try to be a Puritan, unless you're putting it into a contest, but just to prove to yourself that the watercolor has to be done all with watercolor. I mean, I did show you ways to do that. I could have just continued with the Dremel and added more pigment and added this stuff to it as well. That's another possibility. Just more time consuming, but yeah, I could have done that too. There, anyway, I think that concludes the demo. And like I said, if you register in the next course, you get all this documented step by step. The 10 different ways to correct the watercolor paper in a PDF booklet that Cindy's so nicely putting together for us. So I hope you enjoyed the session. So I'll sign off now, and I hope I can see you next Saturday. If you're new, what do you got to lose? $19.99 for 3 classes. You're going to get a lot of information, some beautiful photographs. Maybe I should show them. Well, you can see them if you go to artistnetwork.com, click on Paint Along, artistnetwork.com. Right there on the front page of artistnetwork.com, there's a thumbnail of my Paint Along classes. Click on that. It's going to show you the 3 different reference photos that I will be using during that workshop, and we can expand much more on lines and edges and shapes and things like that. We'll go bit by bit as I think out loud during the whole painting process. So I hope you learned a lot today, how to correct your watercolors, and see you soon. Invite your friends. I'm going to sign off now. Have a nice afternoon, everybody. Thanks for stopping by.